The healer's words had followed her for 17 winters. "That pup won't last," Elder Maeve had declared, her voice as crisp and unforgiving as the first frost. She had been looking at Alara, a small, shivering thing with a cough that rattled her bones. A pup. A disposable piece of the pack. 17 winters later, the words still clung to her like ice. Ilara drew the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, the wool scratchy and smelling of damp earth. The cold was a constant companion, seeping up from the floor of the small outbuilding she called home. It lived in her joints, in the hollow of her chest where the cough was waiting. A wet nose pressed against her hand. She looked down into the bright, intelligent eyes of Fen. He was a runt, just as she had been. Cast aside, deemed too small, too weak to contribute. Maeve had said the same of him. Leave it for the crows. Alara had not. She had found the shivering ball of black fur behind the refuse heap and had tucked him inside her own worn tunic, sharing a warmth she barely possessed. That was 3 years ago. Fen had outlasted the predictions. He was small for a wolf of the Frostfang pack, but his heart was a furnace. He was the only furnace she had. Her own pack treated her like a ghost. She was a whisper in the halls, a flicker of movement at the edge of their vision. The girl who was always dying but never did. Her weakness was an embarrassment, a stain on the strength of the Frostfang. They did not hate her. They simply did not see her. It was worse. The cough came then, a dry, rasping thing that shook her thin frame. She pressed a fist to her mouth, stifling the sound. Weakness was a scent, and she tried not to bleed it into the air. Fen whined, a low thrum of concern in his chest, and rested his head on her knee. "I'm all right, little one," she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. It was a lie. The winter was coming, and this one felt different. The wind had teeth. The cold was deeper, sharper. She felt it in her marrow. Maybe this was the winter Maeve had been waiting for, the one she would not outlast. The thought brought no fear, only a profound weariness. She had been tired for so long. She had outlasted 3 Alpha Kings, Old Man Hemlock, who died in a border skirmish, Iron Fist Valerius, who took a fever that burned him out from the inside, and young Lycan, arrogant and cruel, who challenged the wrong stray and was left broken in the snow. Kings came and went. The pack endured, but Alara just existed, a footnote in the pack's history, soon to be erased entirely. The wind howled outside, a hungry sound. It clawed at the loose planks of her shelter. Fen flattened his ears, his body tense. He was always the first to sense a change in the weather. "A storm," she murmured, stroking his fur. "A bad one." She had a little dried meat left, a handful of winter berries. Not enough. It was never enough. Every day was a calculation of survival. Every calorie counted, every scrap of warmth hoarded. She rose, her joints protesting with a dull ache. "Come, Fen, we need more wood before it hits." The forest was already turning gray, the light failing though it was only midday. The air was thick with the promise of snow, a heavy, static silence that pressed in on her. She moved through the trees, her steps careful. A fall would be a death sentence. Her brittle bones would not knit. Maeve had told her so. Fen trotted ahead, his dark form a shadow against the pale birch trees. He was her scout, her protector. He might be small, but his senses were sharp, and his loyalty was absolute. The snow began to fall, not gently, but in a sudden blinding sheet. The wind became a physical force, shoving her, stealing her breath. Within minutes, the world was a swirling vortex of white. The path back to her shelter was gone. The familiar trees were alien shapes in the gloom. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. She called Fen's name, but the wind tore the sound from her lips. He barked, A desperate sound, somewhere to her left. She stumbled toward it, her boots sinking deep into the rapidly accumulating drifts. The cold was no longer just a companion, it was a predator. It bit at her exposed cheeks, her thin gloves, her inadequate cloak. The cough returned, violent and racking. It stole her strength, leaving her gasping in the frigid air. She was falling. The world tilted, a blur of white and gray. She didn't feel the impact, only a strange sense of release as the fight went out of her. So this was it. This was the winter. Maeve was right after all. Her last thought was of Fen. She hoped the little wolf would be smart enough to find his way back. To survive. Darkness took her. Then, a flicker. A sound. A bark. Close to her ear. A rough, warm tongue licking her frozen cheek. Fen. He hadn't left her. A new wave of despair washed over her. He would die here with her. Something shifted in the whiteout. A shape, impossibly large, loomed over them. It was a man, a giant cloaked in thick black furs. He seemed to absorb the dim light, a creature of shadow and snow. She tried to speak, to warn him away. She was a sickness, a bad omen. But no sound came out. His face was harsh, carved from stone and winter. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, pale and depthless. She saw centuries of ice in them. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Not pity, not concern. Something colder. Recognition? No, that was impossible. He knelt, his movements economical and precise. He didn't speak. He simply slid one massive arm under her knees and another behind her back, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. The world spun. She was pressed against a chest as hard as ancient oak. He was cold. A deep, unnatural cold emanated from him, a cold that had nothing to do with the storm. Fen growled, a surprisingly deep sound for his size, and snapped at the man's leg. The giant didn't even flinch. He just looked down at the small wolf. "She is dying," the man said. His voice was like the grinding of glaciers, deep, slow, and powerful. "You will come, or you will die with her." He began to walk, his long strides effortless in the deep snow. Alara, cradled against him, felt the last of her awareness slipping away. She was being carried into the heart of the storm by a man made of winter itself. She woke to the crackle of a fire. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Warmth. Real penetrating warmth soaked into her back. She was lying on a soft pile of furs before a hearth large enough to roast an ox. The stone around it was black with age. She sat up, a dizzy spell washing over her. The cough rumbled in her chest, but it felt looser, less like shattered glass. Fen was curled at her feet, sleeping soundly, his belly full for what must have been the first time in his life. A half-eaten piece of roasted meat lay near him. The room was vast, a hunting lodge built for giants. Heavy timber beams crossed the high ceiling, and the heads of long-dead beasts stared down from the walls with glass eyes. It was a place of immense power and profound silence, a place of ghosts. "You are awake." The voice came from the shadows. The man from the storm stepped into the firelight. He had shed his heavy outer furs, and now wore simple leather breeches and a dark tunic. He was even larger than she had realized, broad-shouldered and immense. His hair was black, shot through with silver at the temples, and his face was a mask of grim authority. He was the coldest thing in this warm room. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. He ignored the question. He gestured to a small bowl on the hearth. "Broth. Eat." It was a command, not a suggestion. She was too weak to argue. She reached for the bowl with a trembling hand. The broth was rich and hot, and it felt like life itself trickling down her throat. He watched her, his frozen eyes missing nothing. She felt stripped bare under his gaze, her frailty, her worn clothes, her whole pathetic existence laid out for his inspection. She waited for the dismissal, the sneer of disgust. It didn't come. He just watched, his stillness more unnerving than any threat. "This is a place of death," he said, his voice flat. "You should not be here." "The storm," she began. "The storm will pass," he interrupted. "Then you will leave." She nodded, her gaze falling to her hands. Of course. She was a stray he had brought in from the cold, a temporary inconvenience. It was more kindness than she had ever known from her own pack. "Thank you," she said, the words barely audible. For Fen too." His gaze flickered to the sleeping pup. A muscle worked in his jaw. For the first time, a crack appeared in his icy composure. It was not warmth that came through, but a pain so deep and ancient it made her own aches seem insignificant. "The small ones are the first to go," he said, his voice softer, but somehow more terrible. He was not talking about the pup. Not entirely. He turned away and retreated to the shadows, leaving her alone with the fire and his ghosts. Days passed. The blizzard raged outside, sealing them in the silent lodge. He was King Theron, the Alpha King of all the northern packs. She pieced it together from a crest on a tarnished silver goblet, from the sheer crushing weight of his authority. He never spoke of it. He barely spoke at all. He was a king in self-imposed exile, a king hiding from his kingdom in a tomb. They fell into a strange, silent routine. He would hunt, disappearing into the storm for hours and returning with fresh kills, his furs caked in ice, looking more like a winter spirit than a man. He would prepare the food and they would eat in silence on opposite sides of the massive hearth. She spent her time mending. She found a forgotten sewing kit and repaired the tears in her own thin clothes. Then, tentatively, she took his cloak, the one he'd worn in the storm. It was heavy and functional, but a seam was coming undone at the shoulder. Her fingers, though clumsy from the cold, were nimble. She worked by the firelight, the simple task a comfort in the oppressive silence. He found her with it one evening. He stopped in the doorway, his presence filling the room. She froze, expecting anger. He had made it clear this was temporary. She had no rights here, no claim to anything. He walked over and stood above her. He looked down at the neat, tiny stitches she had made. His expression was unreadable. "My wife," he said, the words sounding rusty, as if they hadn't been used in a century. She used to do that. It was the first piece of himself he had offered, a shard of glass from a shattered past. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can unpick it." "No," he said, his voice rough. "Leave it." He walked away. But later that night she found a new blanket by her furs. It was thick and heavy, woven from the softest wool she had ever touched. The boundary was clear. He was a grieving king. She was a stray. But the silence between them was changing. It was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken things. Fen, oblivious to the tension, adored him. The little wolf would follow the king around the lodge, sitting patiently at his feet while he sharpened his knives or stared into the fire. Theron never petted him, never spoke to him, but Alara saw the way his eyes would soften almost imperceptibly when he looked at the pup. He would leave the choicest bits of meat where Fen could find them, a gruff, anonymous act of tenderness. One night, a nightmare shattered the quiet. A scream tore from his throat, a sound of pure agony that had her stumbling from her furs, her heart hammering. She found him by the hearth, the fire burned down to embers. He was on his feet, his hands clenched, his body rigid. The cold pouring off him was terrifying, a physical presence in the room. "Your Majesty?" she ventured, her voice trembling. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes. They were no longer gray. They were glowing with a faint, chilling blue light, the light of a soul freezing over. "Get back," he growled, the sound inhuman. She didn't. She saw the torment in his face, the battle he was fighting against something inside him. This was the source of his coldness. It wasn't just grief. It was a wound. A curse. "You told me this was a place of death," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "But it is the warmest place I have ever known." The honesty of her words seemed to cut through his haze. The blue light in his eyes flickered, then subsided. The unnatural cold receded. He slumped against the stone mantel, his head bowed, his massive shoulders trembling. "They died here," he rasped, the words torn from him. "My mate, my son, murdered. A curse was laid on my bloodline, an ice that grows in the soul. One day it will freeze my heart completely." He was not just haunted, he was dying. A slow, cold death that had been creeping up on him for 100 years. She took a hesitant step closer. She didn't know what to say. What comfort could a half-dead girl offer a dying king? She did the only thing she could think of. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. His skin was shockingly cold, like stone pulled from a winter river. But beneath it, she felt a tremor. A flicker of life fighting against the ice. He didn't pull away. He simply stood there, letting her small, fragile hand rest on him, a tiny anchor in his frozen sea. The storm broke. The world outside the lodge was scrubbed clean, buried under a pristine blanket of white. The silence was absolute. It was time for her to leave. The thought was a physical pain. Leaving this place of ghosts meant returning to a world that wished she was one. Theron seemed to feel it too. The grim mask was back in place, but there was a new tension in his shoulders. He was avoiding her gaze. Before either of them could speak the words that would end their strange truce, a sound came from the forest. The crunch of snowshoes, the jingle of a harness. Fen shot to his feet, a low growl starting in his chest. Theron was instantly alert, moving to the heavy wooden door, his body a fortress. He peered through a slit in the wood. "Visitors," he said, his voice flat and hard, "from your pack." Alara's blood ran cold. Her pack. Why would they come for her? They had never sought her out before. They had been content to let her fade away. The knock on the door was sharp, insistent. Theron swung it open. Standing there, flanked by two burly pack warriors, was Elder Maeve. Her face was a web of wrinkles, her eyes small and sharp like a shrew's. She was bundled in pristine white furs, a stark contrast to Alara's patched brown cloak. "Your Majesty," Maeve said, her voice oozing a sickly sweet respect. She bowed low, but her eyes darted past him, landing on Alara huddled by the fire. A flash of triumph, quickly concealed, crossed her face. "Maeve," Theron said. His voice was devoid of warmth. "This is my territory. You are trespassing." "1,000 pardons, my king," the healer said, straightening up. "We were so worried. This one," she gestured dismissively at Alara, "has been a burden on us for years. Weak-limbed, frail. We feared she had perished in the storm. It is a relief to see she has merely imposed upon your solitude." The insult was clear. Alara was not a guest, but an infestation. Alara shrank back, the old shame washing over her. "She is under my protection," Theron stated. The words were stones dropped into a frozen pond. Maeve's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "Of course, Your Majesty, but her sickness, it is a drain, a weakness that can spread. For the good of the pack, for your own safety, she must be returned to my care." A lie. Maeve had never cared for her. She had only ever pronounced her doom. Alara realized with a sickening jolt that Maeve didn't want her back for her health. She wanted her back to ensure she finally died. Her survival was an affront to the healer's authority. "No," Theron said. The single word carried the weight of a mountain. The pack warriors behind Maeve shifted uncomfortably. No one said no to the Alpha King. Maeve's composure finally cracked. A flicker of venom showed in her eyes. My king, you do not understand. She is a bad seed, always has been. Let me take her off your hands. It is for the best. I will be the judge of what is best, Theron said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. You will leave. Now. Defeated, Maeve bowed again, the gesture stiff with fury. As you command. She turned to go, then paused. At least let me leave her this. A tonic for her cough. The mountain air is harsh. She produced a small vial of dark liquid from her furs and held it out. Ilara stared at it. A gift from Maeve. It felt like a snake coiled in her palm. Theron watched. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. But to refuse would be a grave insult, an accusation he could not yet prove. Ilara took the vial, her fingers numb. Thank you, Elder, she whispered. Maeve gave her a final, chilling smile. Drink it all, little pup. It will make you strong. Then she was gone, her party disappearing back into the white forest. The silence they left behind was heavier than before. Theron stared at the vial in Ilara's hand. Do not drink that, he commanded. It would be an offense, she argued weakly. She is the pack healer. She is a snake, he countered. I saw her eyes. She wished you dead. But Ilara was trapped. To obey the king meant defying her elder, an act of rebellion she couldn't fathom. To obey Maeve. She looked at the dark liquid. Maybe it was just a tonic. Maybe she was being foolish. And a part of her, the part that had been beaten down for 17 years, whispered that Maeve was right. She was a burden. Perhaps this would be a mercy. That night, as the cough tore through her, worse than ever, she drank it. The poison was subtle. It did not burn. It simply deepened the chill in her bones, stole the air from her lungs, and clouded her mind with a weary fog. She hid it from Theron, moving slower, speaking less. She blamed it on the lingering effects of the storm, but he knew. He watched her with a growing storm in his own eyes. The cold inside him was worsening too. Maeve's presence had agitated his curse. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, and during the day, he would be seized by fits of shivering that had nothing to do with the temperature. The ice was advancing. They were 2 candles guttering out in the same lonely room. One evening, he found her collapsed by the woodpile, a fine spray of blood on the snow before her. He swept her up in his arms, his face a mask of cold fury, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. You drank it, he stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a lament. I'm sorry, she coughed, the words wet and ragged. I'm so tired. He carried her inside and laid her by the fire. He knelt beside her, his huge frame radiating a desperate helplessness. The great Alpha King, who could command armies and fell beasts, could do nothing against the creeping death inside her. Why? He asked, his voice raw. Why would you listen to her? She was the healer, Ilara whispered, her vision blurring at the edges. She said I wouldn't last the winter. For 17 years she's been right. I'm just cold. At her words, a terrible change came over him. A tremor shook his body, and the unnatural cold she'd felt during his nightmare returned, 1,000 times worse. Frost began to spiderweb across the floor from where he knelt. His skin paled to a deathly white, and his breath plumed in the air. Theron, she gasped. He looked at her, his eyes now blazing with that terrifying blue light. The poison. It called to the ice. He gritted out, his teeth chattering. It smells of death. He cried out, a strangled sound, and fell. He hit the stone floor with a heavy thud, his body convulsing. The frost spread rapidly, encasing his limbs, climbing his chest. He was freezing from the inside out. The curse had been triggered. The lodge grew frigid, the fire in the hearth seeming to shrink away from the malevolent cold emanating from the king. Fen, who had been hiding, crept forward and nudged Theron's hand, whining pitifully. The pup then climbed onto the king's broad chest, curling into a tight ball, trying to offer his own meager warmth against an ancient, unstoppable winter. Alara watched, her own life fading. They were both going to die here. Maeve had won. She had not only killed the weak pup she despised, but she had taken the Alpha King with her. Despair was a cold, heavy blanket. It would be so easy to let it smother her, to close her eyes and let the winter take her, just as it was taking him. But then she looked at Fen, the small, loyal wolf shivering on Theron's chest, refusing to abandon his post. He was a creature who had been told he was worthless, that he would not survive. And yet, here he was, fighting a battle he could not possibly win, out of sheer, stubborn love. He had learned that from her. A spark ignited in the ashes of her will. A flicker of defiance. Maeve would not win. The cold would not win. She had been dying her whole life. She was tired of it. With a strength she did not know she possessed, Alara pushed herself up. Every muscle screamed and her lungs burned, but she crawled across the floor, the frost crunching beneath her hands. She reached Theron's side. His skin was like ice. His breathing was a shallow, rattling whisper. He was almost gone. She remembered that first winter with Fen, how she had held him against her own skin, willing him to live, pouring her own life force into his tiny body. She placed her trembling hands on Theron's chest, right over his freezing heart. She didn't think of magic. She didn't know any spells or incantations. She thought of Fen's loyalty. She thought of Theron's hidden tenderness, the thick blanket, the choice cuts of meat. She thought of the first real warmth she had ever known, here in this lodge of ghosts. She would not let the cold have it. She closed her eyes and pushed. She pushed with all of her will, all of her pain, all of her stubborn refusal to break. She poured her life, her soul, her very essence into him. "No," she whispered, the word a prayer, a command, a final act of rebellion. "You will not die." Something answered. A warmth bloomed beneath her palms. It was not the heat of a fire, but the gentle, pervasive warmth of the first spring thaw. A soft golden light seeped from her hands, pooling on Theron's chest. It was the color of new sunlight, of life itself. The light spread, flowing like liquid gold. Where it touched, the thick frost sublimated into mist. The deathly pallor of his skin gave way to a healthy flush. The blue glow in his eyes faded, consumed by the golden tide. The power surging through her was immense, terrifying, and beautiful. It was a river that had been dammed for 17 years, and now the dam had broken. It scoured the poison from her own veins, burning away the sickness that had plagued her since birth. The chill in her bones evaporated. The tightness in her chest vanished. For the first time in her memory, she took a full, deep breath without pain. She felt the curse in him, a knot of ancient, sentient cold wrapped around his heart. Her power, this living light, swarmed it. It did not fight with fury, but with persistence. The persistence of grass growing through stone, the persistence of a pup surviving the winter. With a final silent scream that only she could feel, the ice shattered. The golden light receded, drawing back into her. She slumped forward, her energy spent, and rested her forehead against his chest. It was warm. His heart was beating, strong and steady beneath her ear. She had done it. She had healed him. She had healed herself. Theron's eyes fluttered open. The frozen lake was gone. In its place was a clear, deep gray like a northern sky after a storm. He looked up at her, his gaze filled with a dawning wonder. He lifted a hand, slowly, as if testing a limb he thought was lost. He touched her cheek. His hand was warm. "Alara." He breathed her name. It was the first time he had used it. The sound was a revelation. Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow but of overwhelming relief. She couldn't speak. She just knelt there, her hand still over his heart, connecting them. "The cold," he whispered, his eyes searching hers. "It's gone." He had lived with it for a century, a constant gnawing presence. Its absence was a silence more profound than any sound. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "From the ghost that has haunted my entire life. You gave me a home," she whispered back, finding her voice, "when the world had thrown me away." He sat up, his movements still stiff. He never took his eyes off her. He saw her then, not the frail, dying pup, but the woman with the power of life in her hands. He saw the strength that had been hiding beneath the sickness all along. It was not a surprise to him. It was a confirmation of something he had sensed from the moment he found her in the snow. He cupped her face in both of his large, warm hands. "You are not a bad seed," he said, his voice rough with conviction, echoing Maeve's cruel words and shattering them forever. "You are the spring I thought would never come." He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not one of passion, but of reverence. It was the taste of gratitude, of awe, of a life given back. It was the quiet promise of a new beginning. "You are my queen," he said against her mouth. It was not a proposal. It was a statement of fact, as undeniable as the sun that was now streaming through the lodge window. She was no longer a stray. She was the heart of his kingdom. Months later, they returned to the Frostfang Pack's main encampment. It was the height of spring. The valley, once locked in snow, was now a riot of green and wildflower gold. Alara walked beside Theron, not behind him. Her patched cloak was gone, replaced by a simple but well-made tunic of dark green that brought out the new light in her eyes. She no longer stooped to hide her cough. She walked with a quiet, straight-backed confidence. At her heel trotted Fen, no longer a tiny runt, but a sleek, healthy young wolf, his black coat shining in the sun. The pack members stared as they entered the great hall. They saw their long-absent Alpha King, but their eyes were drawn to the woman beside him. They whispered amongst themselves, "Was that Ilara? The ghost? The dying girl?" She looked whole. Elder Maeve was standing by the Alpha's throne, her position of influence clear. When she saw them, her face went pale. She looked at Ilara, at the vibrant health in her cheeks, and the clarity in her eyes. She saw the way the Alpha King looked at her, a look of fierce, protective devotion. And she knew. "Elder Maeve," Theron's voice boomed through the hall, silencing the whispers. "Step forward." The old healer obeyed, her movements stiff. She tried to arrange her features into a welcoming smile, but it was a brittle thing. "We have a great debt to thank you for," Theron continued, his voice dangerously smooth. "Your tonics, they are remarkably effective." He held up the small vial Ilara had kept, so effective, in fact, that they nearly killed a king, and so subtle, they must have been perfected over generations. He let the implication hang in the air. The pack alphas, one after another, who had grown weak or died of sudden illness under Maeve's care. Iron Fist Valerius and his fever. Even, Theron now suspected, the assassins who had murdered his family, who had somehow bypassed all his wards. They must have had help from someone on the inside, someone who could weaken a pack's defenses from within. Maeve's face crumpled. "Lies. The girl is a witch. She has enchanted you." "She is a healer," Theron corrected, his voice dropping to a low growl. "A true healer. She healed the curse your masters placed upon my family a century ago." He looked around the hall, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the pack. This woman has held power here for too long, not by mending, but by breaking. She decided who was strong and who was weak. She culled those she saw as threats, and poisoned those she could not control. He looked directly at Maeve, his eyes cold steel. My mate and son were not killed by rival packs. They were killed by a rot from within this one, a rot you cultivated. The truth of it settled over the hall with a sickening weight. The pack warriors seized Maeve. She didn't fight. All the venom, all the arrogance had drained out of her, leaving a withered, terrified old woman. She was stripped of her title and furs and exiled, cast out into the wilderness she had so often condemned others to. A fate she would not last a single night in. That evening, Theron stood with Alara on the balcony of the Alpha's keep. The air was soft and smelled of damp earth and new leaves. Below them, the pack was celebrating, a mixture of relief and newfound hope infusing their mood. Alara was now their healer, her gentle touch and quiet wisdom already becoming legend. The pup who wasn't supposed to last the winter was now the woman who had brought the spring. Theron took her hand. His was large and calloused, a warrior's hand, but it was filled with a steady, living warmth that anchored her. "I spent 100 years in winter," he said softly, looking out at the green valley. "I had forgotten what this felt like." "I never knew," she confessed, her voice full of wonder. He turned to her, his gray eyes soft in the twilight. "We will learn together then." She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him. Fen came and rested his head on her lap, a contented sigh escaping him. She was home. She was loved. She was not just a survivor, a footnote who had outlasted kings. She was the queen who had saved one, and in doing so, had finally begun to live. The future stretched before them, not as a threat to be endured, but as a promise of many seasons to come.